We all know the Union won the Civil War, but at what cost? By the end of the Civil War, each Republican argued that slavery and its power needed to be abolished. Meanwhile, the moderate side of Republicans claimed that it could be quickly done once the Confederates surrendered as their states repealed secession while accepting the 13th Amendment. The radical side of Republicans soon created the Wade-Davis Bill of 1864, designed to disenfranchise the elements of the Confederates in the South. It would have the government grant African American men the right to vote, while anyone who gave weapons to fight against the U.S. were banned from voting. The bill required votes, including 51% of white men, making sure they took the ironclad oath, swearing that they had never supported the Confederacy or been one of its soldiers. This oath also entailed having them swear loyalty to the Constitution and the Union before they could have state constitutional meetings. However, Lincoln pursued a malice toward none policy, which he announced in his second inaugural address. He asked voters only to support the Union in the future, regardless of the past. He believed that it would be difficult to repair all ties within the Union if the bill passed. He wanted to make sure each South-seceded state reunited with the Union, with everyone staying in peace. As a result, he pocket vetoed the Wade-Davis bill. The veto led the radicals to lose support, but they managed to regain strength by the time Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865 by Confederate supporter John Wilkes Booth and his poorly constructed plan that led to his demise. But even then, it also just showed how much loss the white Southerners felt, many of whom sought consolation through their loss in ways that would be increasingly manipulative and violent. One of their earliest ways of doing so was creating their entitlement to their past, called the Lost Cause, an American pseudo-historical and negationist myth that would claim that the cause of the Confederate States during the American Civil War was just heroic, not really centered on the slavery part. The term originated in the title of an 1866 book by the Virginian journalist Edward A. Pollard, otherwise known as The Lost Cause, A New Southern History of the War of the Confederates. According to Pollard, the term was created at the request of his publisher in New York City, fearing that Pollard's original title would not be catchy enough to sell books. Pollard promoted many of the themes of the Lost Cause, such as the claim that states' rights were the cause of the war, and that Southerners were forced to defend themselves against Northern aggression. He dismissed the role of slavery in starting the war, and understated the cruelty of American slavery, even promoting it as a way of improving the lives of Africans. Pollard's revisionist history continued to have an effect on how slavery and the Civil War were taught in the U.S. Civil rights activists, such as Frederick Douglass, opposed these and wrote on past history, referring it as a wicked folly. Douglass then delivered a speech about slavery as the meaning and cause of the Civil War, saying, "We are sometimes asked, in the name of patriotism, to forget the merits of this fearful struggle, and to remember, with equal admiration, those who stuck at the nation's life, and those who struck to save it, and those who fought for liberty and justice. I am no minister of malice. I would not repel the repentant, but may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I forget the difference between the parties to that bloody conflict." With additional mentioning, although Andrew Johnson was on the Union side of the force and had no real involvement, his time as presidency would influence a lot of the issues present of the rising Southern myth. Due to his perceived leniency towards the South, as he was a Southern Southerner before the Civil War started, Andrew would prevent much effort to force any sort of agreement for the Southern states for full equal rights for blacks, especially with most congressional Republicans viewed black voting rights crucial to their power base in the South. Johnson would take advantage of the Congress as the legislature was not in session, rushing any policies during the Reconstruction movement like large pardons and allowing the South to set up black codes, such as the convict leasing, basically maintaining slavery under a legal format. This caused the state of Mississippi to pass in these black codes, which influenced other states in the South to pass such codes, such as South Carolina, Alabama, and Louisiana in 1865. continuing with Florida, Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, and Arkansas through the following year. Intense northern reaction against the Mississippi and South Carolina laws led some of the states that subsequently passed laws to excite overt racial discrimination. But their way of laws on vagrancy, apprenticeship, and other kinds of topics were made to affect a similarly racist regime. Even states that carefully eliminated most of the overt discrimination in their black codes managed to keep laws authoring harsher sentences for black people. Some of these decisions enraged Republicans by the time Congress returned to session, passing in the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, giving out provisions and shelter for former slaves, as well as protection of their rights in court, defining all persons being born in the United States as citizens. With the exception of the amendment, Congress passed over President Johnson's veto. In a final humiliating gesture, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, which stripped the president of the power to remove federal officials without the Senate's approval. In 1867, Congress established a military reconstruction program to enforce political and social rights for Southern blacks. Johnson tried to claim back his authority during the congressional elections of 1866 by setting out a speaking tour campaign for the people that agreed to his policies. But his way of speeching was very one-sided, attacking the political side against him in a highly vulgar way, losing 1 million Northern votes as a result. Johnson then had one last attempt to challenge the Tenure of Office Act as blatant usurping, where he then fired Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. This would eventually lead him to getting impeached by Congress by a vote of 126-47 due to his violations against the tenure of office. Though by 1 vote margin, he was allowed to serve the rest of his term and not be convicted. In between the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, that was able to extend suffrage to former male slaves of African Americans, which, considering that hundreds of black delegates participated in state constitutional conventions, with 14 African American men serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, 2 of which were a part of the U.S. Senate. As Southerners were noticing these allowances, some of these groups would make terrorist organizations that eroded. One of the earliest examples is the Ku Klux Klan. Regardless of the organizations that were made, they all had a very similar goal: eliminate many black citizens, other ethnics, and any whites showing sympathetic views to create fear and despair for each of those people and to eliminate Republicans down the voting system. The radicals wanted to ensure they could find a president closest to their viewpoints, so they attempted to give their hands to Elias S. Grant for the candidate, with Schuyler Colfax as their additional vice presidential candidate. Grant got their respect when he managed to rehire Edwin Stanton as the Secretary of War, as well as the accomplishments he did for the Civil War. Meanwhile, the Democrats, throwing Johnson out, nominated former Governor Horatio Seymour of New York as the candidate, and Francis P. Blair of Missouri as the vice candidate. The Democrats advocated the immediate restoration of former Confederate states to the Union and amnesty from all past political offenses. Grant won the popular vote by 300,000 votes out of 5,716,082 casted votes, receiving an electoral college landslide of 214 votes to Seymour's 80. Seymour received a majority of white votes, but 500,000 votes cast by blacks aided Grant, winning him 52.7% of the popular vote. However, he lost Louisiana and Georgia primarily due to the ever-growing violence led by the Ku Klux Klan to prevent black people from voting. Immediately upon inauguration in 1869, Grant bolstered Reconstruction by prodding Congress to readmit Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas into the Union, while ensuring their state constitutions protected every citizen's voting rights. Concerned about the plight of African Americans, Grant met with prominent black leaders for consultation and signed a bill into law on March 18, 1869, that guaranteed equal rights to both blacks and whites to serve on juries and hold office in Washington, D.C. Around 1870, Grant signed a Naturalization Act that opened a path to citizenship for foreign-born black residents in the U.S. Additionally, Grant's Postmaster General, John Creswell, used patronage powers to integrate the postal system and appointed a record number of African American men and women as postal workers nationwide while expanding many of the mail routes. Grant would appoint Republican abolitionist and champion of black education Hugh Lennox Bond U.S. Circuit Court judge. Grant would approve the 15th Amendment, where states could not disenfranchise African Americans. Within a year, the three remaining states, Mississippi, Virginia, and Texas, adopted the new amendment and were admitted to Congress. However, if there's one thing to count on throughout the decades, there was a lot of disenfranchisement throughout and after the Reconstruction Era. Throughout the state's existence, especially in the South, they would be based on laws, new constitutions, and practices that were used to prevent black citizens from registering to vote. Efforts were also made in Maryland, Kentucky, and Oklahoma. Considering each state has a governor and mayor who can slightly alter a set of laws created back in Congress, they would be able to thwart much of the objectives, like the 15th Amendment. The laws were frequently written in ways that were ostensibly non-racial on paper, so they wouldn't violate the amendment. Regardless, it was so selective that it suppressed black voters apart from other voters. Meanwhile, Grant put military pressure on Georgia to reinstate its black legislators and adopted a new amendment. Georgia complied, and on February 24, 1871, its senators were seated in Congress, with all the former Confederate states represented. Republicans and formerly enslaved people controlled southern reconstructed states. To enforce Reconstruction, Congress and Grant created the Justice Department that allowed Attorney General Amos Ackerman and the first Solicitor General Benjamin Bristow to prosecute the Klan. In Grant's 2 terms, he strengthened Washington's legal capabilities to intervene directly to protect citizenship rights, even if the states ignored the problem. For about 2 years, Congress and Grant passed a series of influential civil rights, such as the Enforcement Acts between 1870 and 1871, designed to protect blacks in Reconstruction governments. These criminal codes protected the freedmen's right to vote, hold office, serve on juries, receiving equal protection of laws. In fact, they authorized the federal government to intervene whenever states did not act, something that did not go well. Because of the massive attacks through the Ku Klux Klan breaking set of laws and constantly committing murders of innocents, Grant and Ackerman passed the Ku Klux Klan Act on April 20th, 1871, eliminating much of the group for over a year by arresting them, causing some others to cowardly flee the United States or hide into other groups. Similar insurgent paramilitary groups arose that were explicitly directed at suppressing Republican voting and turning Republicans out of office. The White League, which started in Louisiana in 1874, and the Red Shirts, which started in Mississippi and developed chapters in the Carolinas. For instance, the Red Shirts are credited with helping elect Wade Hampton as governor in South Carolina. They were described as acting as the military arm of the Democratic Party, and are attributed with helping white Democrats regain control of the state legislators throughout the South. In one of the last major acts to preserve Reconstruction and equality for African Americans, Grant and Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875 on March 1st of that year, created by Senator Charles Sumner, which Grant endorsed despite his feud with the man before. There, it attempted to outlaw discrimination for blacks in public accommodations, schools, transportation, and selecting juries. Unfortunately, it was enforceably executed weakly, as it spread fear among whites who were opposed to interracial justice, and was overturned by the Supreme Court in 1883. Coincidentally, many of these acts were borrowed for the more vital Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Lyndon B. Johnson, who was one of the significant factors that arguably changed the Democratic Party into what it is now. This obviously led to supporters to who they sided with feeling divided, or basically just causing a switcheroo. Back on track, however, there was a counter-vote fraud in the Democratic stronghold of New York City. Grant sent in tens of thousands of armed, uniformed federal marshals and other election officials to regulate the further elections. Democrats across the North then mobilized to defend their base and attacked Grant's entire set of policies. On October 21st, 1876, President Grant deployed troops to protect black and white Republican voters in Petersburg, Virginia. Sadly, Grant's support from Congress and the nation declined due to scandals within his administration and the political resurgence of the Democrats in the North and South. Anti-Reconstruction whites would claim that wealthy white landowners had lost power, and they blamed government scandals in the South for it. Meanwhile, white Northern Republicans were becoming more conservative. Major Republicans and black Americans lost power in the South. Many of the Republicans at the time felt the war goals had been achieved. They turned their attention to other issues, such as economic policies, one of the most effective of these being schools. Uncertain of the reactions, the Republicans began creating a system of public schools, with each race segregated, except New Orleans. Generally, elementary and a few secondary schools were built in most cities, and occasionally in the countryside, but the South had few cities. This did not help when the rural areas faced many issues maintaining their existence. Schools were just one-room buildings with poor teacher payments, and education was somewhat cautious. More and more violence increased, terrorist attacks kept on going, blacks were being lynched, and Republicans kept fleeing offices. Gubernatorial elections were close and had been disputed in Louisiana for years. Supposedly, the Compromise of 1877 rolled in, and the government withdrew the last federal troops from the South to get Southern support in the presidential election to keep the economy afloat and prevent more incoming violence. No written evidence seems to exist, and its precise details are a matter of debate. But most historians say that the federal government would adopt a leniency policy towards the South to ensure federal authority through Republican Rutherford B. Hayes' election as president. The campaign strategy of Hayes and Wheeler emphasized conciliatory appeals to the Southern Whiggish element, attempting to detach old Southern Whigs from Southern Democrats. When Frederick Douglass asked whether the Republican Party would continue its devotion to protecting black civil rights, or get along without the vote of the black man in the South, Hayes and Wheeler advocated the latter. As Hayes won the Republican nomination for president in the 1876 United States presidential election, where he defeated Democratic nominee Samuel J. Tilden while losing the popular vote, his tenure as president would officially end the Reconstruction Era. The white Democrats regained more political power in every southern state. These southern white Redeemer governments legislated Jim Crow laws, officially segregating the country's population. Those laws were a manifestation of an authoritarian rule directed explicitly at one racial group. Black Republicans felt betrayed, as they lost their political legitimacy in the South, which the federal military had defended. Grant would try to obtain the Republican nomination for a third term in 1880, but failed to do so. 5 years after, he began suffering as he impoverished and died of throat cancer. Beforehand, Grant wrote in his memoirs, covering his life through the Civil War, which were posthumously published and became a major critical and financial success. However, due to the pseudo-historical and negationist mythology of the lost cause of the Confederacy spread by Confederate sympathizers around the turn of the 20th century, historical assessments and rankings of Grant's presidency suffered considerably before they began recovering in the 21st century. Although black people were still elected to local offices throughout the 1880s in local areas with large black populations, their voting was suppressed for each election. States passed laws to make voter registration and electoral rules more restrictive, with the result that political participation by most black people and the poor white people decreased, thanks to movements like the Lily White movement. The ultimate downfall started during an underlying case in 1892, when Homer Plessy, a mixed-race man, deliberately boarded a whites-only train car in New Orleans. Plessy violated Louisiana's Separate Car Act of 1890 by boarding the whites-only vehicle, which required equal but separate railroad accommodations for white and black passengers. Plessy was charged under the act, and at his trial, his lawyers argued that Judge John Howard Ferguson should dismiss the charges because the act was unconstitutional. Ferguson denied the request, and Louisiana Supreme Court upheld Ferguson's ruling on appeal. Plessy then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. During Douglas's last years, He spoke in Baltimore in 1894, where he said, "I hope and trust all will come out right in the end, but the immediate future looks dark and troubled. I cannot shut my eyes to the ugly facts before me." In May 1896, the Supreme Court issued a 7-1 decision against Plessy, ruling that Louisiana law did not violate the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, stating that although the 14th Amendment established the legal equality of whites and blacks, it did not and could not require the elimination of all distinctions based upon color. Shortly after, the U.S. Supreme Court decided to pass in the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, where racial segregation laws did not violate the U.S. Constitution as long as the facilities for African Americans were equal in quality to those of white people, a doctrine that came to be known as separate but equal, a decision that legitimized the many-state reestablishing racial segregation that had been passed in the American South by the end of the Reconstruction Era. This set the standard throughout the South and institutionalized the Jim Crow period. Everyone was supposed to receive the same public services, but with separate facilities for each race, with the facilities reserved for blacks always of lower quality than those reserved for whites. Segregation was not mandated by law in the northern states, but a de facto system grew for schools in which nearly all black students attended all black schools. Racist ideologies grew expensively as the years passed on, and the lost cause myth spreaded sporadically thanks to people like Thomas Dixon Jr. writing novels glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, diminishing blacks as violent sexual deviants. And some people were interested in these books to the point of adaptation. One of the most infamous examples would happen to be The Birth of a Nation, which was the very first film to be screened at the White House, with the president at the time being Woodrow Wilson. While there were civil rights movements coming in and out, like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, at this point it was mostly a minor set of people who were trying to advocate against racism, and it would take about almost 4 to 5 decades for equal rights to occur. All in all, as Mick LaSalle quoted, "They say that history is written by the victors, but the Civil War has been the rare exception. Perhaps the need for the country to stay together made it necessary for the North to sit silently and accept the South's conception of the conflict. In any case, for most of the past 150 years, the South's version of the war and Reconstruction has held sway in our schools, our literature, and, since the dawn of feature films, our movies."